Hi, Sarah from Homfray Embroidery. So it's become apparent recently that there's more to this little humble skein of thread than meets the eye. So I thought in this video we'd take a closer look and see how to use them. So these threads are probably the most popular kind of thread for doing hand embroidery. They're available all over the world. They're quite inexpensive really, and they come in a great range of colours. So they're made by lots of different manufacturers, and I've got a few here just to show you some. So this is an Anchor one. So this is now owned by Coats, which is made in Germany. This is a DMC, which is a French make. I've got a little green one here, which says made in China on it. There we go. This one, who knows where that one's made? Don't know. Got an American one here, one I bought over in America. And this is an Australian brand as well. Cottage Garden Threads is an Australian one. So these are all the same kind of thread from different manufacturers. So these threads here are cottons, they're stranded cottons, but I just want to show you these quickly. So these are stranded silks. So in this video I don't want to look at brands particular or even what it's made of, but I just want to show you the way that we use these threads is the same, and it will, all the information will apply to both. So I think the first thing that I should mention is what these are actually called. So I'm in the UK and we call these stranded cottons. If you're in the US or other places in the world, you might know them as floss. You might call them stranded floss or floss threads. They are the same thing, but because I'm in the UK, I'm going to stick to stranded cottons. So also worth mentioning is some of the cheaper brands aren't made of cotton, so you'll need to check the label for that. If you haven't seen it yet, do check out my video up here where I try out some of the cheaper threads and see if they're any good. So the first thing to do is to establish what kind of thread you've got. So they're all labelled up with lots of information about the thread on them. So it will tell you what they're made of. So this Anchor one here is made, let's turn it the right way around, so 100% mercerised cotton. Now mercerisation is a process they put the thread through, and it makes it shinier and it makes it smoother and softer to the touch. So this one has been mercerised. Actually this one's been done twice, and so has the DMC one. So this one just says cotton on it, both upside down, so cotton there, and it doesn't say mercerised, but I know for a fact that both of these are. So they're nice and soft and shiny, and it will also give you how much is on it. So 8 metres on here, and tiny little bit down here, 8 metres or 8.7 yards if you like yardage. So it tells you what it's made of and how much you've got in your skein on the label. This one here is made in China, and it does say 100% cotton on it. It doesn't feel like the other two, it feels a lot coarser, so I'm guessing that this hasn't been mercerised, which is why it's a bit cheaper. It's still cotton, but it doesn't feel soft. It's not quite as shiny as the other two, and it does say 6 metres on this, so not quite as much thread on this one. So this one is an Art Studio one, and it doesn't say anywhere on it what this is made of, so presumed it was acrylic. I have done a little burn test on it and it did melt quite spectacularly, so I'm pretty sure that's all acrylic. So do check your labels for what your thread is actually made of. Now the other thing the labels give you is washing instructions, so you can wash all of these threads, which is great if you want to embroider your clothing or some bed linen or a baby's bib or something. You can actually bung this in the wash, but again do check the instructions on the label. They've all got that on, whichever brand they are, to tell you how to actually wash this item. Now I have been asked, do you need to wash these threads first? If you're stitching on something you're going to put in the washing machine, wash that thing first, but you don't need to wash these threads first. They're ready to go straight out of the skein. So the first thing to know is, how do you get your thread out of the skein? You don't need to undo the little labels. It's very easy. So it's got what's called a pull-free construction to this thread. So you need to find the right end. There's 2 ends. So there's a little one there that's right on the top of the threads that comes out from the label. It's not that one. It's the other one, which if you turn the skein over, is actually hidden inside the thread. Goes right down in the middle underneath. So it's that one that you want to pull. If you pull the other one, your skein will get in a knot. So I'm just going to pull that out. And what that gives me is that length of thread. It goes once down the skein and back again, and it gives me that length, and that length is great for stitching with for most stitches. So if you hold that in your finger, it's actually to the inside of your elbow, which is a good measurement, and it's all wound so it comes out exactly the right length for you, so you don't need to worry about how much you need. It's just one pull up and down the skein. So then I can cut that off. So next time I want to pull it, it's that one that's inside and not the one that's on the top on the outside. So we've got one piece of thread from our skein. Now the magic of this is it's made up of 6 individual threads. So each thread has been twisted and then 6 pieces have just been placed together. They're not twisted together, they're just placed together. So there's 6 strands in there and you can choose how many you want. So there's a lot of versatility with this thread. So I'm going to show you how to take these apart first. So you notice on the end here, if I just separate them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 strands there. Now the easiest way to do this is to take one strand in your finger. I'll hold it up so you can see that on the camera, and if you just pull straight up you can take one strand out and this doesn't get knotted, and this works every time. So one strand straight up, nothing gets knotted. If you try and pull them apart or pull 3 strands apart, this will all get twisted underneath and you end up with a big knot. So straight up each time, and they'll never be knotted. So then you can choose how many strands you want and you can put these strands back together. So 1, 2, 3, and I've got 3 strands ready to use for my embroidery. So I just want to point out at this stage about putting the strands back together. If you were mixing your colours, you would pull 2 colours out from one, 2 from another, and then put those together loosely. If you were using 4 of the same colour, you don't necessarily have to do that. And I appreciate that might get a few comments below, but I do think it depends on what you want to stitch. If you're doing something like needlepoint, yes, strand them all and put them all back together. It covers the canvas nicely, makes the thread fill out a little bit, and makes good coverage of your canvas. If you're doing something a bit more freestyle, I don't necessarily think you have to take everything apart and put it all back together. French knots, for example, are a bit easier if you don't do that, because the threads all stay together and you don't have a problem with tension on the thread. So it's really very personal and it comes with experience a lot, but I say you don't need to do it all the time. But if you want to do it all the time, take all of them apart regardless of how many colours you're using, put them all back together and use them like that. That's absolutely fine. So the thing I get asked a lot is, what do you do with the strands that are left that you're not stitching with? How do you store those? So the easiest thing to do is to wrap them back around the skein. So I just fold them in half like so, put the skein over the top, make a lark said knot, and it's there on your skein ready for the next time you need some more strands. Now the other thing I should mention now, because I have been asked this a few times, is should you use the thread in the direction it comes off the skein? So if you pull it, is that the front of the thread and that the back, and the next time you pull it, is it the same? And I have heard this said because it's said that the fibres lie in one direction, so they kind of have a nap, and you should always use it in the same direction. Now we have had a close look at these threads under 14 times magnification to see if this is true or not, and it's very hard to tell if it is. It's not obvious. My advice would be, don't spend your time worrying about that. It really is going to make absolutely negligible difference, so just enjoy your sewing and don't worry about that. So definitely the #1 question I get asked about these threads is, how many strands do I use? I'm afraid there isn't a simple answer to that question because it relies on so many different factors. So the type of embroidery that you want to do, what stitches that you want to use in it, how you want the overall thing to look. A couple of other considerations as well is how much it costs. Now this thread costs all sorts of different amounts wherever you are in the world, and in a previous video this has caused a lot of interesting comments to come out about how much they cost. So we did find a really interesting article on this, and we'll put that in the description below this video, on some reasons why they cost different amounts in different parts of the world. One of the other reasons is the time that it takes to stitch something. The finer the thread, the longer it will take to stitch, so that might be a consideration, especially like me, if you have to make your money, make your living from doing your hobby, that might be something that you want to consider too. So what I suggest you do is to do some sampling and actually try some stitches out for yourself. Now I've made a little one for you to show you roughly what it does on the few different stitches, so let's have a look at that here. So I've used these stranded cottons that we've got for sale in the shop. These are made by Madeira, so another different make, and these are 6 strands as well, and they're variegated, so they've got beautiful colours. So those are the ones that I've used. And I've started with a simple stitch, so the simplest stitch you can get, which is a running stitch. So you can see here quite clearly 1 strand, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6 strands, and what the difference in those is. So not so much difference maybe between a couple of them, so 6 and 5 and the jump from 4 to 3, but the differences between this end and this end are quite large, so you would really need to try those out first and see which one that you want for your project. Now 6 will go in a lot faster because it's covering more fabric in one go, and 1 will take a lot of time and look more delicate. And I also found with this it was harder to be neater with 1 strand than it was with 6. 6 sort of hid a few problems, if there were any problems, where 1 it's on its own, it's very fine, it's very delicate, you've got to get it really neat, so that is something to consider as well. Now I also tried the same thing in a different stitch. So this is a chain stitch, and I've used the same number of threads that I've used for the running stitch. Now you can see what a difference there is in these 2 stitches, even though I've used the same number of threads. This one is extremely thick now, this chain stitch in 6 strands and going down to 1. So the type of stitch you use will make a massive difference to how it looks as well. So if you know what stitches you want to use, it's always worth just having a spare bit of fabric, trying them first in a few different amounts of thread and seeing which one you like the look of. So these stitches that I've used here are actually 2 different stitches. I've got a French knot on the top and a colonial knot on the bottom. So again, 1 strand, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. And you'll notice with this stitch how much the number of strands affects it. So one strand of a French knot is tiny, really tiny. There might be occasions where you want this tiny little dot of a stitch. Probably won't be many, to be honest. So very small 1 strand for a French knot, whereas 6 strands gives you something much more substantial. So whereas 6 strands on the chain stitch is quite thick and chunky, 6 strands on a French knot isn't, so it's going to change hugely depending on the stitch you want. The one underneath is a colonial knot, as I said, so it's like a French knot with an extra wrap in it. So you can see how much bigger these are. So even just changing the stitch from a French knot to a colonial knot will make a difference as well. So even the single strand is twice the size. So you've also got the option to think, do I change the stitch or do I change the number of strands I use? And that sounds like an awful lot going on, and I wouldn't worry about it too much, but just to show you what different options you have just by having this choice of 6 strands. The other thing that I should mention at this point is you will need a different needle compared to the number of strands that you are using. Do check out our video up here on how to choose the right needle size, because that's pretty important. But don't use 1 strand with a really large needle, the same needle you would use for 6, because it will just fall out of the needle. The other thing that happens is the needle will make the hole in the fabric, and if your needle is too big, you will make a big hole in the fabric and the thread will just pass through it and the hole will remain there. So these stitches here where I've used 6 strands are actually quite chunky, and if you use a fine weave fabric or a needle that's too big or too small, in fact, you will damage the fabric, you'll damage the thread, and the fabric will start to pucker up and you'll get all sorts of things going on. So do be aware of the size needle and make sure you've got the right one for the right job. So some of the things you might want to consider when you choose how many strands to use is how much do you want to see it. So if you're going on clothing, 1 or 2 strands isn't going to be very obvious, you're not going to see it, so you might want something a bit more punchy, so maybe look at 4 to sort of 6 strands. Equally, if you were doing some long and short stitch shading, which relies on you mixing the colours together and blending the colours together to get beautiful effects, this is much more effective if you use fewer strands. So 2 strands and 1 is really popular for this because you can get loads of subtle shading in it. So it really does depend on the stitch you want to do and the effect that you want to have. So it's definitely worth grabbing a little bit of spare fabric and a frame and trying things out before to get the right effect for you. The more experience you have of stitching and the more you do, the more it will become instinctive how many strands you need. So if you think, oh, I've got to sample absolutely everything, it's going to take me hours, it won't. Just do it initially and you'll get the hang of what the stitches begin to look like with that number of threads, and you'll be much more intuitive in the future. So I just want to show you what to do with the skeins at the end of their life, because I've had quite a few people ask me this, is when you've used quite a bit of the thread, how do you maintain the thread and how do you make sure it's still got its label on? So this is one that happens a lot, is you've used half the skein and the labels are loose. So an easy trick for this is all you need to do is to fold the small label in half, and if you slide the big label over it, then that tightens that up and it still all stays on the skein. I think it's worth keeping them in the skein. They store really well like this. You've still got the number with it, and you can use that pull method to pull out the right amount. Now, what if the labels come off your thread, but you've still got enough of it that you want to put the label back on? Well, you can re-wrap it. Now, the trick to this is to wrap in a figure of 8. If you do the figure of 8, then you'll be able to use the pull method to pull your thread out. So you can just do it around your fingers, and if you make a smaller skein, then it can go back on the label. So I'll just wrap. I've just done a figure of 8 with my leftover thread, and this is smaller than they come in, it's a shorter length. So there's my figure of 8. You can see that. That means when I pull one end, I'll be able to pull it out. And all you need to do is twist up that end. And if you just twist it in the skein, you can pull that through, and you've got a little short skein, but because it's a lot thicker, the label will stay on. So you've got that last little bit of thread left. You don't want to throw it away, rightly so, it's still usable. What do you do with that? So the easiest thing to do is to fold it in half, put the loop on the label, just wrap it round, put the two ends through the loop, pull it tight, and then you've got your little thread left with the number still on it, and it's all nice and tidy, ready to use for that final project. So I hope that was useful and you learned something about the humble skein of thread. Do check out our channel for loads more videos like this, all about hand embroidery. You can see lots over here, and you might really like this one here, and we'll see you in another video.